The morning sun crept softly through the thin curtains of Richard Carter's modest home, painting golden stripes across the old oak dining table. A half-empty cup of coffee sat beside a worn leather wallet, and on the wall above the counter hung a framed photograph, a little girl in a pink dress, missing her front teeth, holding her father's hand on her first day of school. Richard smiled faintly as he looked at it. His daughter, Emily, his reason for every sacrifice. Today, she was getting married. He inhaled deeply, straightening his tie in the mirror by the window. The suit wasn't new, in fact. It was the same one he'd worn to her high school graduation 7 years ago. But it was pressed, clean, and carried the faint smell of cedar from the old wardrobe he'd kept since his youth. For Richard, it wasn't about appearances. It was about being there. He had promised his late wife, Laura, that he would never miss a single milestone in their daughter's life. And today he was keeping that promise, though his heart ached that Laura wasn't here to see their little girl in her wedding gown. He brushed a hand through his graying hair, sighed, and looked around his living room, quiet, filled with memories. The bookshelf still held Emily's childhood trophies, her sketches from college, and a collection of architecture books that used to belong to him back when he was still Richard Carter, architect. He whispered to himself, "She made it, Laura. You'd be so proud." Richard's story wasn't one of failure. It was one of devotion. Years ago, he'd been a respected architect, known for designing public buildings with soul, not just structure. His work had been featured in local magazines, and his firm once handled prestigious projects across the city. But when the recession hit, his partners abandoned him, clients pulled out, and the company fell apart. He lost everything, his office, his savings, even their home. At the time, Emily was only 15. Too young to understand why her father was suddenly home all the time, too proud to let her see him cry in the garage at night. So he found small freelance jobs, drafting designs for local builders, consulting for startups that could barely afford to pay. He did it quietly, without complaint, without resentment. Every penny went into Emily's education. Every late night sketching was for her future. Now that future was here, wearing a white gown, waiting at a chapel across town. At exactly 10:30, there was a knock at the door. Richard opened it to find Emily standing there, radiant and glowing, her eyes sparkling with tears. "Dad," she whispered, "I couldn't leave for the salon without seeing you first." He chuckled softly, his throat tight. "You're not supposed to see me before the ceremony, sweetheart. Isn't that bad luck? Maybe," she smiled, "but I needed a hug." Richard wrapped his arms around her carefully, afraid to wrinkle her pristine dress. The scent of her perfume, lavender, her mother's favorite, hit him with a rush of memory so powerful he had to blink back tears. "You look beautiful, Em," he said finally. "Your mother would have been." His voice cracked. "She would have been over the moon." Emily's eyes shimmered. "I know, I miss her so much." He cupped her face gently. "She's here, always." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint chirp of morning sparrows outside. Then Emily laughed softly, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Nathan's been so busy this morning, meetings, calls. Something about his boss attending the wedding. He's been so nervous about making a good impression." "His boss?" Richard asked lightly. "That's a bit unusual, isn't it?" "Yeah," Emily smiled. "But Mr. Anderson's like a mentor to him. He really respects him. It means a lot that he's coming." Richard nodded approvingly. "That's good. A man who earns the respect of his superiors is doing something right." Emily squeezed his hand. "And a man who earns the love of his daughter is doing everything right." He chuckled softly. "Now that's the kind of compliment I could get used to." After she left, Richard sat alone for a few minutes, the quiet wrapping around him like an old blanket. He thought about the years that had brought him here, the nights spent tutoring Emily in math, the mornings he drove her to school in a rusting pickup truck, the day she graduated from college. While he stood in the crowd, clapping the loudest, he remembered the pride in her eyes when she first told him about Nathan. "He's smart, Dad, ambitious, confident you'll like him." And he had liked him at first. Nathan had been charming, all polite smiles and firm handshakes. He called Richard sir, and talked about architecture like it was a shared passion. Richard thought, asterisk finally. A young man who values hard work and vision. Asterisk, but over time, subtle things had changed. Nathan stopped calling him sir. He teased him for using an old flip phone. He'd once joked, "You should really try LinkedIn, Richard. It's what professionals use." Richard had laughed it off. After all, Nathan was young. The world was different now. He never imagined those small jabs would turn into something cruel. As the clock neared noon, Richard locked his front door and stepped outside. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of maple leaves. He took a slow breath and smiled. Today wasn't about him. It was about Emily, her happiness, her new beginning. He arrived early at the church, greeting the ushers, shaking hands, helping wherever he could. He arranged flowers when the florist got flustered, calmed a nervous bridesmaid, even carried in boxes of programs from the car. When Nathan arrived with his groomsmen, he seemed distracted, talking loudly into his phone, barely nodding at Richard. "Big day?" Richard said kindly, patting his shoulder. "Yeah," Nathan replied, smirking. "Just making sure everything's perfect. My boss is coming, so I can't afford any slip-ups." Richard smiled, missing the edge in Nathan's tone. "Well, you've already got the perfect bride." Nathan laughed shortly, turning away to check his reflection in the window. "Yeah, I do." As the ceremony began, Richard sat in the front pew, his hands trembling slightly. When Emily walked down the aisle, radiant and graceful, his heart nearly burst with pride. She looked every bit the woman Laura had dreamed she'd become, strong, kind, and full of light. When Nathan lifted her veil, Richard smiled through tears. Asterisk, he'll take care of her, asterisk, he thought. Asterisk, that's all that matters. Asterisk, after the ceremony, the newlyweds posed for pictures outside the church. Richard stood quietly to the side, watching Emily laugh, as the photographer snapped photos of her and Nathan. She caught his gaze once and mouthed, asterisk, "I love you, Dad." Asterisk, he nodded, his heart swelling. In that moment, everything felt right. The past, the pain, the loss. All of it had led here, to this joy. He didn't know that within hours, that same joy would be shattered by a few cruel words. For now, he allowed himself the peace of a proud father watching his daughter begin her new life, unaware that destiny was quietly preparing its own kind of justice. The sun was sinking low when the reception began, casting long amber shadows across the glass-paneled ballroom. Chandeliers glimmered overhead like frozen stars, and soft piano music filled the air. The scent of roses and champagne mingled as guests laughed, danced, and congratulated the newlyweds. Emily looked radiant, her white gown glowing under the lights. Nathan stood beside her, grinning broadly, every inch the charming groom. Together, they looked like a picture from a magazine, the kind of image people frame and hang on their walls to convince the world that happiness can be captured. And in the corner of the room, quietly smiling, stood Richard Carter, the proud father who had made it all possible. He didn't need attention or praise. Watching Emily's joy was enough. Her laughter, so pure and bright, was the only gift he ever wanted. The reception hall was filled mostly with Nathan's world, colleagues in sharp suits, managers with expensive watches, women in sleek cocktail dresses. They spoke of investments, company expansions, and promotions over glasses of imported wine. Richard felt slightly out of place among them. His suit was plain, his shoes well worn, his wrist bare of any fancy watch. Yet he carried himself with quiet dignity, as though his worth was carved from something deeper than status. He stood near a table, sipping orange juice instead of wine. when a tall man with silver hair and an easy smile approached him. "You must be Emily's father," the man said warmly. "I'm asterisk asterisk, Mr. Anderson asterisk asterisk, Nathan's boss." Richard turned, pleasantly surprised. "Ah, yes, I've heard your name many times. My daughter and Nathan both speak very highly of you." Anderson chuckled. "I hope they tell the truth, then." "They do," Richard smiled. "It's an honor to meet the man who helped shape my son-in-law's career." Anderson extended his hand. "Likewise, you must be very proud." "I am," Richard said softly, watching Emily from across the room. "She's everything her mother and I ever hoped she'd be." Anderson nodded approvingly. "That's what a father's love does. It builds strong foundations." Richard smiled at the phrase. Asterisk foundations. Asterisk, he liked that. It reminded him of architecture, of how every strong structure begins with something unseen, uncelebrated, but essential. Dinner began, and laughter rippled through the room. The best man's toast was full of jokes and memories, and Emily's maid of honor brought tears to everyone's eyes with a heartfelt speech about true love. When it came time for the groom's speech, Nathan stood up, glass of champagne in hand, the confident glint of a man who loved the sound of his own success. He cleared his throat dramatically. "First, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. This day is the most important of my life, marrying the love of my life, Emily." The guests clapped warmly. Emily blushed and squeezed his hand, and of course. Nathan continued, "I have to thank my boss, Mr. Anderson, for coming tonight. I know you're a busy man, sir, and it means the world to me that you could be here." Anderson smiled politely and lifted his glass. Nathan's voice grew bolder, more theatrical as he began introducing the key people in the room, his parents, his friends, his coworkers. Each introduction came with a story, a joke, a touch of charm. Then, with a half-smirk, he turned toward Richard's table. "And last but not least," he said loudly, "I'd like to introduce my father-in-law, Mr. Richard Carter." The room turned toward Richard. He gave a polite nod, raising his glass slightly. Nathan paused, then added with a chuckle, "Richard's a good man, though, between us, he's kind of our asterisk, unemployed loser asterisk of the family." A few people laughed, a forced, awkward kind of laugh that flickered and died almost immediately. The air changed. Richard froze. For a split second, he thought he'd misheard. But no, the words echoed, cruel and sharp, cutting through the warmth of the evening like glass through silk. Unemployed loser. The phrase rang in his ears, louder than the music, louder than the laughter. He felt Emily stiffen beside Nathan, her hand slipping from his arm. "Nathan," she whispered, horrified. "What did you just say?" "Oh, come on, babe," Nathan said, still grinning. "It's a joke. Lighten up. Everyone knows Richard's between jobs, right?" He glanced around for approval, but the room was silent. Richard forced a small, polite smile, his throat tightening. "It's all right," he said quietly. "He's just being funny." But his voice trembled ever so slightly, and Mr. Anderson noticed. The older man's brow furrowed as he looked between the two. His gaze lingered on Richard, the dignified posture, the weary eyes, the quiet restraint. Something about him didn't match the word asterisk loser asterisk. Anderson leaned toward Nathan. "That's quite an introduction, son," he said evenly. Nathan chuckled nervously. "Oh, it's just a bit of humor, sir. My father-in-law's a humble man, not really into business or anything." "Is that so?" Anderson asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Richard, feeling the weight of the room's gaze, cleared his throat softly. "It's quite all right, Mr. Anderson. I prefer a simple life these days." Anderson nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A simple life?" he repeated. "Sometimes that's where real wisdom lives." The rest of the dinner passed in uneasy silence. Conversations picked up again, but the warmth had gone from them. Emily barely spoke to Nathan, her smile forced in every photo. At one point, she leaned close to her father, her voice trembling. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know he'd say that. I swear I didn't." Richard patted her hand gently. "It's fine, sweetheart. Let's not ruin your night." But inside he felt something breaking, not anger, not shame, but something heavier. A lifetime of quiet dignity had just been turned into a punchline. And yet, even in that moment, he didn't lash out. He didn't storm away. He stayed for Emily's sake, for Laura's memory, for the promise he'd made to always stand tall for his daughter. Later in the evening, as the music softened and guests began to dance, Mr. Anderson approached Richard again. "Would you join me for a moment?" he asked quietly. Richard hesitated, then followed him out to the terrace. The night air was cool, the city lights reflecting off the water in shimmering streaks. "I wanted to apologize," Anderson said after a pause. "That was an uncalled for remark. You handled it with grace." Richard smiled faintly. "There's no need for apologies. He's young. I was once like him, confident, loud, certain I knew everything. Time humbles us all." Anderson studied him, his mind turning. "You said your name was Richard Carter." "Yes." Anderson's eyes widened slightly. "Carter. You wouldn't happen to be the Richard Carter who designed the Haverford Public Library, would you?" Richard blinked, surprised. "Yes, that was one of my projects many years ago." Anderson exhaled, almost in disbelief. "My God, that building inspired me to study architecture. I was in college when it opened. The way you used light and space, it changed the way I saw design." Richard looked down modestly. "That was a long time ago. Life took different turns after that." Anderson was quiet for a long moment. Then a slow, knowing smile crept across his face. "Different turns, perhaps, but the foundations you built still stand." He patted Richard's shoulder and turned back toward the ballroom. "Stay here a moment. I think it's time your son-in-law learns something about respect." Richard stood on the terrace, the night breeze brushing against his face. From inside he could hear the faint sound of clinking glasses and laughter resuming. He didn't know what Anderson planned to do, nor did he expect anything at all. He was used to letting the world move on while he quietly endured. But tonight, fate had other plans. As he gazed through the ballroom's glass doors, he caught sight of Nathan, still grinning, oblivious, boasting to his colleagues. For the first time, Richard felt no sadness, only calm, a calm before a reckoning that, by the end of the night, would make the entire room remember the name asterisk, Richard Carter asterisk again. Sure, here's asterisk asterisk chapter 3. Asterisk the sweet twist asterisk asterisk asterisk, written in full. This chapter delivers the emotional punch, revelation, justice, and that perfect, unforgettable line, all built on quiet dignity and poetic karma. The hum of conversation inside the ballroom was growing again when Richard stepped back in from the terrace. The air was a little warmer now, thick with perfume, wine, and the fading sweetness of wedding cake. Mr. Anderson had disappeared somewhere into the crowd. Richard didn't think much of it. He was simply relieved to have the moment outside to breathe again. He took a seat at his table, watching Emily twirl slowly on the dance floor with her bridesmaids. Her smile was beautiful, but strained, the kind of smile a daughter wears when she's trying to be strong for her father. Richard knew that look. He'd worn it himself for years. A quiet sigh left him. Asterisk, she deserves better than embarrassment on her wedding day. Asterisk, he reached for his glass of water just as the microphone at the front of the room crackled to life again. Nathan stood there, his face flushed with confidence, one hand around Emily's waist. "All right, everyone," he announced cheerfully. "Before we wrap up, I just wanted to thank you all once more for coming. And of course, another round of applause for my boss, Mr. Anderson, for joining us tonight." Polite applause followed. Anderson rose from his chair near the front and took the microphone with a calm, steady smile. "Thank you, Nathan," he said. "And congratulations to both of you. It's a beautiful wedding, truly." His voice was warm, but there was an undercurrent beneath it, something measured, deliberate. Richard watched as Anderson's gaze swept across the room, resting briefly on him before returning to Nathan. "I was especially moved tonight," Anderson continued, "because I got to meet someone very special, your father-in-law, Richard Carter." The mention of his name sent a ripple through the guests. Richard felt every pair of eyes turn his way. He smiled politely, but felt his pulse quicken. Anderson continued, "You all may not realize this, but Richard Carter isn't just a man who raised a wonderful daughter. He's also a man whose work quite literally helped shape this city." Nathan blinked, confused. "What do you mean, sir?" Anderson smiled slightly, the kind of smile a teacher gives before a lesson. "I mean that your father-in-law is the Richard Carter the architect who designed the Haverford Public Library, the St. Joseph's Cultural Center, and the Greenleaf Gardens Pavilion, three of the most respected public spaces in our region. His work inspired generations of designers, including me." The room fell utterly silent. Gasps, whispers, and the faint clink of a dropped fork punctuated the heavy air. Emily's eyes widened. "Dad, is that true?" she whispered, tears brimming. Richard hesitated, his throat tight. "It's something I used to do," he said softly. "A long time ago." Anderson turned back to Nathan. "A long time ago or not, his legacy stands tall. In fact, I credit Richard Carter's designs as the reason I became an architect. When I learned tonight that this brilliant man was called *unemployed loser* in front of a crowd, I was shocked and, frankly, disappointed. Nathan's face went pale. "Sir, I didn't mean it was a joke, really." Anderson raised a hand, silencing him. "A joke, perhaps, but words reveal character, Nathan, and character, more than talent, determines a man's future." He paused, his voice calm but ringing with quiet authority. "When you insulted your father-in-law, you didn't just show arrogance, you showed ignorance. You belittled a man who embodies the humility and grace this profession demands." The audience was frozen, every eye on them. Emily's hand slipped from Nathan's arm. Anderson stepped closer, meeting Nathan's trembling gaze. "You've been with my firm for 2 years. You're talented, ambitious, but I've also seen signs of pride I hoped time would cure. Tonight, I saw the truth." Nathan swallowed hard. "Please, Mr. Anderson, I don't," Anderson said quietly. "The mark of a professional is respect. If you can't respect the people who built the path you walk on, you don't deserve to walk it." He straightened his tie, turned to the crowd, and in a clear voice said the words that would echo in that hall for years to come. "Nathan, you're fired." The silence was absolute. Even the music stopped. Emily gasped. Someone near the back dropped a glass that shattered against the marble floor. Nathan stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing, unable to form words. "Fired," he stammered. "Sir, please." "This is my wedding." Anderson's expression didn't change. "Then, perhaps it will be a lesson you'll remember for the rest of your marriage, if it lasts the night." Laughter rippled quietly through a few guests, but most remained still, watching, stunned, as Nathan's world collapsed before them. Richard sat there, motionless, stunned not by the firing, but by the weight of what had just unfolded. He hadn't wanted revenge. He hadn't wanted to humiliate anyone, but justice, it seemed, had arrived uninvited. Nathan turned to Richard then, desperation in his eyes. You could fix this, right? Tell him it was just a misunderstanding." Richard looked up slowly, his face calm. "Nathan," he said softly, "I've spent my life building things that last. Trust, integrity, family. You broke all three in a single sentence." Nathan's lip trembled. "I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did." Richard interrupted gently. "That's what makes it hurt." Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "Nathan, I don't even recognize you right now." He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. Her expression was shattered, part fury, part heartbreak. "I stood beside you today, believing you respected my family," she said. If you can humiliate my father, the man who gave me everything in front of everyone, what happens when no one's watching?" Nathan's shoulders sagged. "Emily, please," but she was already walking toward Richard. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "Can we go home?" He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." As they walked toward the exit, guests stepped aside, whispering, offering quiet words of apology and admiration. Mr. Anderson caught Richard's arm gently. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone respectful, almost reverent. "If you ever decide to return to architecture, my firm would be honored to have you. No man with your skill and humility should ever be forgotten." Richard smiled faintly. "You're kind, but I think my building days are behind me." Anderson shook his head. "Maybe not. Sometimes the world just needs to remember your name." Richard chuckled softly. Maybe, as he left with Emily, the night air hit him like a fresh breath, cool, clean, alive. For the first time in years, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel old or broken. He felt seen. The ride home was quiet. Emily sat beside him, her hand clutching his tightly. "Dad," she said at last, tears in her eyes, "I didn't know. About your buildings, about what you used to do. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Richard smiled gently, watching the road ahead. "Because, my dear, the things we build aren't just made of stone or steel. They're made of love, and I had already built you." Emily cried then, not out of sadness, but pride. When they reached home, Richard helped her out of the car. The porch light glowed softly above them, casting their shadows long across the driveway. He paused, glancing up at the sky, a sea of stars above the quiet neighborhood. Somewhere out there, Laura was watching. He could almost hear her laughter. "Guess we did okay, huh?" he murmured softly. Back at the reception hall, Nathan sat slumped at a table, ignored by the same people who had laughed at his jokes hours earlier. Anderson's words replayed in his head again and again. Asterisk, "You're fired." Asterisk, he looked toward the door where Richard and Emily had walked out, and realized too late that the man he had mocked was everything he could never be: a builder, a father, a man of worth. Outside, as Richard closed his front door behind him, Emily hugged him tightly. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm so sorry for everything. I should have seen what kind of man he was." Richard kissed her forehead gently. "You saw it when it mattered. That's what counts." They sat together in the living room for a long while, father and daughter, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house they had built together. On the wall, the old photograph of Emily as a little girl still hung proudly, a reminder of all the love and sacrifice that had brought them to this moment. And though the night had begun with humiliation, it ended with something far greater: truth, dignity, and the unshakable bond between a father and his daughter. Sure, here's the final part of your story. This last chapter, asterisk, redemption and new beginnings, asterisk, ties every emotion together: the loss, the humiliation, the justice, and the rebirth of a father who never stopped loving his daughter. The days following the wedding passed in a blur. What had been meant to mark a joyful beginning became a quiet period of reflection, a collapse and a rebirth folded into the same moment. For Emily, it was the hardest week of her life. The media posts, the whispers among friends, the messages from guests, everyone had something to say. But through it all, she never left her father's side. She stayed at his house that first night, sitting at the kitchen table where she'd once done her homework, the air smelling faintly of coffee and rain. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared peace, like two souls that had been through the same storm and found each other again on the other side. "Dad," she said softly one morning, "I can't believe I didn't see who he really was. I thought Nathan loved me for who I was, but I think he only ever cared about how I looked on his arm and how I made him look in front of others." Richard looked up from his newspaper, his smile gentle. "People like that don't love anyone, Em. Not really. They love the reflection of themselves they see in others." Emily sighed. "I should have listened more, paid attention to how he talked to you. I kept brushing it off as nerves or pride. I was so blinded by what I wanted him to be. Richard folded his paper carefully. We all do that, sweetheart. We see the potential in people and hope they'll grow into it. That's not a mistake, that's love. But the hardest part of growing up is realizing love can't fix arrogance. Her eyes glistened. You always make things sound so simple. He smiled faintly. That's because I've lived long enough to know that complicated hearts still need simple truths. A few days later, there was a knock at the door. When Richard opened it, he found Mr. Anderson standing there, holding a thin leather portfolio and a sincere smile. "Good afternoon, Richard," he said. "May I come in?" "Of course." They sat in the living room, two architects from different eras, bound by respect. Anderson set the portfolio on the table and pushed it gently toward Richard. "I meant what I said the other night. I'd like you to come work with me, or rather, with us. We're starting a new community development project downtown, affordable housing, schools, parks. We could use someone who understands how to design with heart, not just numbers." Richard's brow furrowed. "I appreciate that truly, but I've been out of the field for years. I'm not sure I'd even remember how to hold a drafting pencil." Anderson chuckled. "You never forget how to build, Richard. It's in your bones." He opened the portfolio. Inside were sketches, outlines for a new public library. At the top of the blueprint read, *concept collaboration, Carter Anderson redevelopment. Richard stared at it, his throat tightening. "You want me to design this? I want you to guide it," Anderson replied. "I can handle the paperwork and the business side, but the soul of this project, that should be yours." For a long time, Richard said nothing. He just looked at the plans, his fingers tracing the familiar lines, the curves, the shapes of imagination returning after years of silence. Finally he nodded, his eyes wet. "All right, let's build something worth remembering." The months that followed brought a kind of joy Richard hadn't felt in years. Each morning he woke with purpose. His small home studio, once a dusty corner filled with old sketches, came alive again. The smell of fresh graphite and paper filled the room. Emily would often join him, sitting across the desk, watching as he drew. "Dad," she said one evening, her chin resting on her hand, "I think you love buildings more than people." He smiled without looking up. "Buildings don't talk back." She laughed, and for the first time in weeks the sound was free and full again. But then he added, softly, "No, I love what buildings mean. They stand when people fall. They shelter, they endure. They're a promise in stone that something can last." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "That's how I see you, you know." He stopped drawing. "How's that? You stand when people fall. You don't break, you rebuild." His smile faltered for just a moment, touched by the sincerity in her voice. "Maybe I finally learned that from watching you." When spring arrived, the new project the Carter Community Library was unveiled to the public. The name wasn't Richard's idea. It had been Anderson's. At first, Richard protested, "That's not necessary," but Anderson had insisted. After what happened, the city deserves to know the man behind the foundation, literally. On the day of the ground-breaking ceremony, sunlight glimmered off the scaffolding. Cameras clicked, reporters gathered, and the mayor gave a short speech about legacy, art, and humility. Emily stood proudly beside her father as he stepped up to the microphone. He looked out at the small crowd, students, families, city workers, and smiled. "Most people think architects build with steel and glass, but those are just tools. What we really build with is faith. Faith that the world needs one more place to belong." He paused, looking down at the fresh earth before him. "For a long time, I thought I'd lost everything, my career, my confidence, my place in the world. But then I realized what I was building all along wasn't made of walls or windows. It was her." He turned to Emily, his voice softening. "My daughter was my masterpiece." The crowd applauded, but Emily was already crying, wiping at her cheeks as she hugged him. In the months that followed, The Carter Community Library began to rise, a structure of glass and wood, open and full of light, designed to feel like home to anyone who stepped inside. Emily helped oversee parts of the project: community outreach, design choices, decoration. She found purpose in it too, working side by side with her father. One afternoon, as they walked through the nearly finished atrium, sunlight poured through the skylight, bathing everything in gold. Emily looked up at the arching beams and whispered, "It feels alive." Richard smiled. "That's how you know it's right. A good building breathes." He ran his hand along the smooth frame of the central pillar. A small plaque had already been placed there, waiting to be unveiled at the grand opening. Asterisk asterisk dedicated to Laura Carter, the heart that built the dream. Asterisk asterisk. Emily rested her head against his shoulder. "Mom would have loved this, I know," Richard said quietly, "and she'd have loved seeing you here even more." A few weeks later, Richard received a letter in the mail, formal stationery, gold trim. He frowned at first, then chuckled when he saw the sender, asterisk Nathan Collins. Asterisk inside, the handwriting was shaky, uncertain. Asterisk, Mr. Carter, asterisk asterisk. I owe you an apology that words can't cover. I've spent the last few months replaying that night in my head, and the shame hasn't left me. Losing my job was the least of what I deserved. I lost something far greater, the respect of a woman I loved, and the chance to be part of a family I never truly appreciated. Asterisk asterisk. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to thank you for teaching me, even in silence, what real strength looks like. You never raised your voice, never retaliated. You just stood tall. I hope one day I can be half the man Emily calls her father. Asterisk asterisk. Sincerely, asterisk asterisk. Nathan asterisk. Richard folded the letter quietly, his expression unreadable. He placed it in a drawer beside old photographs and blueprints. He didn't feel anger, not even satisfaction. Just peace. Some lessons in life don't need revenge, only time. On a mild evening a few months later, the library opened its doors to the public. The building glowed from within like a lantern, its walls filled with laughter, stories, and light. Richard stood by the entrance, greeting visitors, watching children run between the aisles of books. Emily joined him, her arm looping through his. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked quietly. He smiled, "Sometimes, but I think about this night more." She nodded, leaning her head against his arm. "I think Mom would be proud." He looked up at the fading sky, where the last rays of sunlight painted the clouds pink and gold. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think she'd say, we finally built something that lasts." The doors of the library closed gently behind them as they stood together, not as victims of betrayal, but as builders of a new beginning. And somewhere in the calm of that evening, the faint echo of Laura's laughter seemed to dance through the halls, carried by the wind, mingling with the sound of pages turning. The story of a man who lost everything only to rebuild something far greater.